Thank you, Dr. Chitra. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, yes.
So I'll be taking you through the thyroid eye disease with the carry home points that a postgraduate needs. So the points that I'll be discussing is what really does a thyroid eye disease mean? What are the most important factors in its pathogenesis? What is the epidemiology? What do you need to know about the signs and symptoms? What investigations do you carry out? What are the current classifications? What is the non-surgical and the surgical management? So we'll go through them very briefly. So thyroid eye disease is a sight-threatening as well as disfiguring autoimmune inflammatory disorder affecting the orbit and the periorbital tissues, characterized by these characteristic findings, which we will be talking about. Now, pathogenesis is important because this is important in all the newer therapeutic approaches that are coming up as targeted therapy. So you need to know that essentially the orbital fibroblasts, which have the potential for differentiation both into adipocytes and myofibroblasts, which express these receptors, the insulin-like growth factor 1 receptor and the TSH receptor, because these are the circulating factors which are responsible for the thyroid disorder, and they are also responsible for the thyroid eye disease. Now, once these receptors are stimulated, there is an activation which leads to recruitment of the T and B lymphocytes and macrophages with upregulation of the cytokines, which are important in the pathogenesis, along with the augmentation of glycosaminoglycans. Now, these depositions lead to new adipogenesis as well as fibrosis, which result in extraocular muscle enlargement as well as the physical expansion of orbital fat. Now, this is the uh, picture from Dr. Santosh Honavar's editorial in the August issue, and you must look closely at it. So we were talking about the orbital fibroblasts with expression of TSH receptors and insulin-like growth factor 1 receptors, which are stimulated and which result in the T cells, B cells, and macrophages being stimulated, release of cytokines, and the result is myofibroblasts and adipocytes and glycosaminoglycans, leading to the characteristic orbital changes. And this also shows you where our targeted therapy or the biologics are acting in this entire cycle. So let's look at how important this disease is. Now, this disease would affect people generally between 30 to 60 years of age. We've had some very nice data in this issue of Indian Journal. And one of those articles shows that the average age in Indians is about 40 years, which is in the same range, somewhere between 30 and 60. Females are more likely to develop thyroid eye disease, as we all know, but this figure is much lower in Indians, 1.1 to 1, as compared to Caucasians, where it is 4:1. Now, thyroid eye disease is a very common disease which includes hypo and hyperthyroid, hypothyroidism being much more common, with 42 million people in India having thyroid disease. And in hyperthyroidism particularly, how common is prevalence of the thyroid eye disease? Now, the Caucasians show an expression of thyroid eye disease in about 40%. Europeans, a similar figure, which is again Caucasians. Whereas some figures suggested that in Asians, the figure is as low as 7.7%, but some other studies showed from the epidemiological studies that the figure may be as high as 35%. So how commonly do you get sight-threatening disease in thyroid eye disease? Now, this figure may possibly be lower in India, and that is why the interventions that we need are possibly lesser than those in Caucasians. The UGO-GO study had 28% of thyroid eye disease patients having sight-threatening disease, whereas the figures in India suggest somewhere between 2 and 7.5%. Now, what is the clinical course that a thyroid eye disease takes? You've all heard of the Rundle's curve, which is a characteristic representation of the disease, which shows an increase, then goes into a plateau, and then comes down, but does not come to the basal level. Now, this phase of inflammation would be variable, anything between 6 and 18 months, but all cases do not follow a characteristic pattern. The symptoms may be redness, irritation, decreased vision, bulging of the eye, double vision, pain, or loss of visual field. And the signs, the most common ones are exophthalmos, extraocular motility restriction. We'll talk about this in greater detail later. The eyelid signs, many of which you need to remember the names. Some of the examiners may be very fond of them. The conjunctival and corneal signs, corneal exposure, conjunctival congestion, lid edema, and of course, retraction and all those characteristic signs. Optic neuropathy can be particularly important because of the visual loss, and so are the exposure keratopathy. And rise of intraocular pressure also can be quite common. All of these may together be present only in about 5% of the cases. Now, proptosis may be either unilateral or bilateral, but bilaterality is much more common, approaching 97% in studies, and is classically axial. Extraocular motility restrictions are present in 1/3 to 1/2 of the cases because of the various changes of swelling and fibrosis. But what need to remember is that inferior rectus is the most commonly involved muscle, followed by medial rectus. Eyelid retraction is a very characteristic sign, with the temporal flare being quite characteristic. There may be eyelid swelling, eyelid erythema, and a characteristic lid lag. In conjunctival and particularly caruncular congestion may be quite typical. Exposure keratopathy can frequently occur, and this may go on to progress to ulceration. Optic neuropathy, or the compressive optic neuropathy of the thyroid eye disease, is particularly important, which you must look for by monitoring all these signs which suggest optic nerve function on each visit, including visual fields. And this is characteristically caused by the crowding of extraocular muscles near the apex. An early diagnosis by the monitoring is important to start therapy. The ocular hypertension occurs because of elevated episcleral venous pressure, as well as due to restrictive myopathy and increased mucopolysaccharides in the orbit, particularly in the aqueous outflow systems. So you need to do all these examinations, including exophthalmometry, look for all signs of activity, and do monitoring of the function and motility of optic nerve. And imaging is important because extraocular muscles thickening and the type of changes, whether they are predominantly fat or predominantly muscle changes, also need to be assessed. You need to know about the characteristic thickening where there is a tendinous sparing in these cases. So you can have a muscle predominant or a fat predominant exophthalmos. And apical crowding is something that you particularly need to look for. Now, classifications The classic no specs classification is a mnemonic which we were all familiar with as undergraduates, given by Werner, but this is no longer so functionally important, although you do need to know all the components involved in the no specs classification. What is most important and most commonly used in many clinics across the world is the clinical activity score described by Moritz et al. Because it gives you whether a patient may be classified as active or inactive, and it's a very simple system. Now, there are these 10 points which you need to look for, and generally these 7 are the modified ones which you need to particularly talk about: spontaneous retrobulbar pain, pain on eye movements, eyelid erythema, conjunctival injection, chemosis, swelling of the caruncle, and eyelid edema or fullness. So if you have a score of more than 3, then it is an active disease. And this is what you should be documenting. Now, visa classification is also used quite commonly, where it is based on a vision, inflammation score, strabismus score, and appearance score. But the UGOGO classification is important because it has a lot of importance in clinical management. It characterizes the disease as mild when the parameters of eyelid retraction, soft tissue involvement, or proptosis are minimal and there is no diplopia and or corneal exposure, which is simple and responsive to lubrication. But it becomes moderate to severe if these limits are exceeded and there is a diplopia. And it becomes sight-threatening when there is an optic neuropathy or corneal breakdown. Now, this classification is followed very commonly because this characterization into these 3 groups is important for management. So let's look at the management now. The medical management is important. Control of thyroid status possibly being one of the important things which you would do, but smoking cessation has been shown to be important. Selenium orally is also considered as a therapy. Radioactive iodine as a therapy for thyroid eye disease may have a role in precipitating the disease. You need to know about this. You need to know about the role of steroids. You need to know about the role of radiation and immunosuppressors and biologics. And we'll very briefly talk about them. Ocular management, mainly in form of lubricants, taping, and altered head position, may be important. Smoking cessation has been shown by several studies to be important, and this must be one of the first advices you give to your patients. For corticosteroids, it is now more or less a consensus that IV therapy is more effective than oral therapy and possibly would lead to lesser side effects, and it leads to medical decompression, and which is of vital importance. So it is used both for compressive optic neuropathy and moderate to severe disease where your purpose is to minimize the final loss that is left to the patient. The, the characteristic dosage protocols of UGOGO, which are commonly used, are these, but there are several other protocols. If you remember these may be more than sufficient for you. For the optic neuropathy, the characteristic dose is 0.5 to 1 gram for 3 consecutive days or alternate day for 2 weeks. For active disease, moderate or severe, you would use 0.5 gram weekly for 6 weeks and then 0.25 gram weekly for 6 weeks. And what has been found to be important is that if you exceed the dose of 8 grams, you increase the complications which threaten the life of the patient. So you would generally make sure that you confine the dosage to less than 8 grams. And the study showed that the dose which is on the higher side has the greatest positive response. Orbital irradiation is indicated in active disease with severe thyroid eye disease and has been shown to have a positive response. And some of the protocols that are followed is the standard protocol of 20 gray in 10 days, or a reduced dose protocol of 10 gray over 2 weeks, or a low dose protocol where 20 gray is used over 20 weeks. And a fairly good safety has been shown with the current protocols. The biologics are increasingly coming to the fore in the management, and various biologics have been used, including rituximab, TNF-alpha inhibitors, but teprotumumab may have a game-changing role. It has been shown to be important in reducing the all of thyroid. Already received an FDA approval. The limiting factor is the extremely huge cost, and that is why it would take a while before it can be used more widely. So the indications for surgery are corneal exposure, which is not responding, or a sight-threatening optic nerve compression. However, expanding indications include a congestive orbitopathy, which is not responding, or aesthetic indications, which are increasingly used now, and they are important because it has a profound effect on the life of the patient. So as we said, your approach would be decided by whether this disease is predominantly due to increased orbital fat or due to enlarged extraocular muscles. And therefore, your strategy may change from fat removal to predominantly bone removal. So that is the customization that you carry out. Isolated fat decompression can be useful in some cases, and a reduction of almost a millimeter per milliliter of fat removed can be carried out in those where there is a predominant fat disease. In the muscle predominant disease, you need to do a lot more bony decompression. And for mild to moderate exophthalmos, fat and deep lateral wall decompression is the preferred strategy with very little possibility of any side effects and gives excellent results. We'll skip this part. Where the severe disease is concerned, you may add more walls. In addition to fat, you may do a lateral and medial wall, the so-called balanced approach. And for even more severe cases, you may need to add floor decompression, and you, however, compromise with an increased risk of producing new diplopia. So there is a sequential wall decompression approach which Dolman points out, orbital fat being considered as the first wall, and you gradually add the second or third or fourth wall depending on what the amount of proptosis is, and it causes an increased risk of diplopia. So the treatment algorithm is based on that approach, and we will summarize by saying that mild exophthalmos, fat predominant, you may do just fat decompression. Muscle predominant, you need to combine it with lateral wall. In more than 3 millimeters exophthalmos, fat predominant, you would need to do, in addition to fat, the lateral wall. But in a muscle predominant disease, you need to combine it with medial wall as well. In compressive optic neuropathy, the removal of posterior medial orbital wall and the palatine bone is particularly important. It is a focused decompression of the posteromedial orbit, but you need to leave the anterior part of the medial struct intact to avoid diplopia. And the various approaches are similar to what Santosh told you. Upper lid crease incision is increasingly used for the lateral wall or the deep lateral wall, which is commonly used. And transconjunctival approach with lateral cantholysis is used for approaching the medial wall and floor along with the transcaruncular approach. So these are the approaches. This is the crease incision. This is the caruncular approach. And you can combine it with the phonacial approach, which Santosh talked about. Worsening of diplopia is the most common problem, although hypoesthesia and malpositions of canthus and lid can also occur. So the final examples are that you can reduce the compression reduce the proptosis very significantly by doing a hidden transconjunctival approach. You can see the reduction in the amount of proptosis that you get in one eye and the other eye following decompression. For congestive disease, similarly, you can take care of the congestion after decompression, again done with a transconjunctival approach, reduce congestion, reduce proptosis, and also improve the optic neuropathy function. This is an example of a cosmetic indication where after the two-stage approach of decompression and blepharotomy, we could improve the cosmetic appearance very significantly. So what is important to remember in thyroid eye disease is that you need to do it sequentially wherever indicated. First orbital decompression, then take care of the motility, and finally the eyelid surgery. And eyelid surgery, eyelid retraction is the commonest thing that you need to do, but you need to ensure that you abolish scleral show and maintain normal lid crease and contour. We can use both the posterior and anterior approaches, including the blepharotomies, Muller's muscle surgery, as well as sometimes for severer cases, you may need to put in a spacer. So these are the results of the various surgical approaches for orbital disease. To summarize, a better understanding of the disease, improvements in targeted medical therapy with decreased functional and aesthetic disability, minimizing the need for surgery, and improved minimally invasive customized surgical approaches have led to much more gratifying outcomes in the management of thyroid eye disease. And we may be looking at a paradigm shift in the management over the next few years with our better understanding. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chitra, for the opportunity to be a part of this ARC webinar for the postgraduates. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashok. It was